The night my father retired after 40 years at the same company, I stood in the back of the room like a stranger. When someone asked who I was, my brother laughed and said, "Oh, her? She's nobody." My father heard it, and instead of correcting him, he smiled. For a moment, I thought maybe they were right. Maybe all the years I had worked quietly meant nothing to them. But a few minutes later, my father's boss stepped up to the microphone. He began telling a story about the person who had saved the entire company. Then he paused, looked across the room, and read my name out loud. "If you've been through something no one should ever have to endure, but you're still here, watching this video. You survived. Where are you? Where are you watching from? Your story matters. And you're not alone." And to understand why my own family believed I was nobody, you have to go back to the morning of my father's retirement party, the day I almost decided not to show up at all. The invitation arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning. I found it tucked inside my mailbox between a stack of bills and a grocery flyer. The envelope was thick, the kind people use for weddings or formal events. My father had always liked things to feel important. When I opened it, a gold card slid into my hand. Retirement celebration for Robert Carter, 40 years of service. I stared at the words longer than I expected to. 40 years. My father had spent more time inside that company building than anywhere else in his life. When I was a child, I used to imagine the place as some giant machine that had swallowed him whole. He would leave before sunrise and come home smelling like office coffee and paperwork. The invitation said the party would be held at the Grand Meridian Hotel downtown. Formal dinner, speeches, employees and executives invited. Family welcome. I set the card down on my kitchen table and leaned back in my chair. For a moment, I wondered if it had been sent to me by mistake. My relationship with my family had always been complicated, not explosive, not dramatic, just quietly distant. My brother Jason had always been the one my parents talked about with pride. He was loud, confident, the kind of person who liked to tell everyone exactly how successful he was. When Jason got his first sales job, my father told every neighbor on the street. When he bought his first car, my mother posted pictures of it everywhere. When I graduated from college, my father simply said, "Good. Now you can start figuring out what you actually want to do." I smiled a little at the memory, though it wasn't really funny. Jason had always been the center of their attention. I had learned early that the easiest way to keep the peace was simply to stay quiet. And over time, that quiet had turned into distance. I picked up the invitation again. The paper felt heavy in my hands. Part of me wanted to ignore it. It wouldn't have been the first family event I skipped. Over the years, there had been birthdays, dinners, and holidays where my absence had gone almost unnoticed. But this was different. This was my father's retirement. 40 years of his life, coming to an end in a single evening. Even if things between us had never been perfect, he was still my father. I stood and walked to the window of my apartment. The city outside was already alive with the slow rhythm of morning traffic. Somewhere down there, people were heading to offices, meetings, ordinary days. I knew that building too well. The company where my father had spent his entire career. The company whose future had once rested quietly on my desk for months. I shook the thought away. None of that mattered tonight. Tonight wasn't about me. I returned to the table, picked up the invitation one last time, and slid it into my bag. Then I whispered softly to the empty room, "I'll go." Not to prove anything, not to explain anything, just to be there. Because no matter how distant our family had become, some moments in life still deserved witnesses. As I turned off the kitchen light and headed for the door, a strange thought crossed my mind. At the party tonight, surrounded by hundreds of people who worked for the same company, I would probably be the only person in the room my family believed they didn't need to notice. And honestly, I was fine with that. After all, tonight, I would just be another guest. The drive to the hotel took about 20 minutes. I left my apartment just before sunset, when the sky was turning that quiet shade of gold that only appears for a few minutes before the evening traffic takes over the city. The Grand Meridian Hotel stood near the river downtown, one of those places that tried very hard to look elegant. Tall glass windows, polished stone steps, and a doorman who greeted every arriving guest with the same professional smile. I pulled into the parking lot and turned off the engine. For a moment, I didn't move. Through the windshield, I could already see people walking toward the entrance, men in suits, women in dresses, groups of co-workers laughing as they made their way inside. My father's world. I rested my hands on the steering wheel and let out a quiet breath. Family gatherings had always followed the same pattern. Jason would arrive first, loud and confident, shaking hands and making sure everyone knew exactly who he was and what he had accomplished recently. My parents would stand beside him, smiling proudly. And somewhere along the line, someone would ask about me. It usually happened the same way. "So, how is Emma doing these days?" Jason would shrug. "Oh, she's doing something with business or computers or something like that." My father would nod politely. "Yes? She's still figuring things out." That sentence had followed me for years. Still figuring things out. I wasn't even sure they realized how often they said it. When I was younger, I used to try explaining my work to them. I would talk about projects, long meetings, late nights spent solving problems that most people never even saw. But those conversations never seemed to land anywhere. My father liked simple success stories, titles, promotions, numbers that could be easily explained at dinner. Jason understood that language perfectly. He was the kind of person who could turn any conversation into a story about himself. I remembered one Christmas dinner a few years ago when Jason had spent almost an hour explaining a bonus he had received at work. My parents listened with the same proud smiles they had worn for most of his life. At one point, my mother had turned to me and asked, "And what about you, Emma? How's work?" I had opened my mouth to answer. But before I could say anything, Jason laughed and said, "Oh, Emma's always working on secret projects." Everyone had chuckled, even my father. I had laughed too. Sometimes it was easier that way. A pair of headlights flashed behind me in the parking lot, pulling me back into the present. Another car had arrived, and more guests were stepping out, heading toward the bright entrance of the hotel. The party had already started. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. Simple black dress. Hair pulled back. Nothing that stood out. Perfect. Tonight wasn't about explaining anything. It wasn't about correcting anyone. It was just about showing up. I grabbed my purse, stepped out of the car, and joined the slow stream of people heading toward the entrance. The lobby was already filled with music and conversation. Somewhere deeper inside the building, I could hear the soft clinking of glasses and the low murmur of a crowd gathering for speeches. My father's retirement celebration had clearly begun. I followed the signs toward the banquet hall. The doors were wide open. Inside, dozens of round tables filled the room, decorated with white flowers and company banners. At the far end stood a small stage with a microphone. Employees moved around the room, greeting each other and sharing stories about the man they had worked with for 4 decades. And then, just as I stepped into the room, someone near the center turned his head. Jason. He spotted me immediately, and the expression on his face made it clear he hadn't expected me to come. Jason stared at me for a moment, as if he wasn't completely sure I was real. Then he walked toward me, weaving through small groups of coworkers holding glasses of wine and plates of food. "Emma?" he said, stopping a few feet away. "You actually came." I smiled politely. "Hi, Jason." He looked me up and down, clearly surprised. Not in a rude way exactly, just the way someone reacts when something doesn't quite match their expectations. "I didn't think you'd show up," he said. "I got the invitation," I replied. Jason chuckled lightly and glanced around the room. "Well, this is kind of a company thing," he said. "Most of the people here are Dad's coworkers." I figured. He shrugged and motioned toward the crowd. "Come on, I'll introduce you to a few people." Before I could answer, he was already guiding me toward a small group of employees standing near one of the tables. "Guys," Jason said casually, "this is my sister, Emma." A man in a gray suit nodded politely. "Nice to meet you." Jason took a sip of his drink and added with a grin, "She's not in the company or anything. She just came to see Dad tonight." The words were said lightly, almost like a joke, but I recognized the tone. The same tone he had used for years whenever someone asked about me. The group nodded politely, though one woman tilted her head slightly as she looked at me. For a brief moment, her expression changed, almost like she was trying to place where she had seen me before, but she didn't say anything. Jason clapped his hands once. "Anyway," he said, turning back to them, "Dad's probably going to start making his rounds soon. 40 years in the same place. People are practically lining up to congratulate him." Across the room, I could see my father standing near the stage. He looked exactly the way he always did at company events. Straight posture, confident smile, shaking hands with people who clearly respected him. Jason leaned closer to me and lowered his voice. "Just try not to disappear, okay?" he said. "Mom likes it when the whole family shows up for pictures." "I won't disappear," I said quietly. He nodded, satisfied, and turned back toward the group. As I stood there, listening to the low hum of conversations around the room, I noticed something strange. A few employees kept glancing in my direction. Not rudely, not suspiciously, just curiously, like they recognized something about me. Before I could figure out why, the music in the room slowly faded. Near the stage, someone tapped the microphone. The room began to quiet down, and a familiar voice said, "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming tonight to celebrate Robert Carter's retirement." I looked toward the stage, and for the first time that evening I saw the man standing beside my father, the CEO of the company, Daniel Harrison, and when his eyes briefly met mine across the room, he smiled. The room settled into silence as the CEO stepped up to the microphone. "Good evening, everyone," Daniel Harrison said, his voice calm and steady. A few people clapped politely. Others raised their glasses. "Tonight," he continued, "we're here to celebrate a man who has dedicated 4 decades of his life to this company." Applause filled the room again. My father stood beside him, smiling with the quiet pride of someone who had spent years earning respect from the people around him. I watched from the back of the room. Jason, however, was already moving again. He leaned toward the group we had been standing with and whispered something that made them laugh softly. Then he glanced over his shoulder at me. "Come on," he said, gesturing with his hand. "You shouldn't stand all the way back there." Before I could respond, he guided me closer to the center of the room, where several managers were gathered. "Hey," Jason said loudly, catching the attention of 2 men in suits. "Have you met my sister?" They turned toward me politely. "This is Emma." One of them nodded. "Nice to meet you." Jason smiled, clearly enjoying the moment. "She decided to show up tonight," he added casually. I said nothing. Another manager asked, "Do you work in the company too?" Jason laughed before I could answer. "Oh no," he said. "Emma's not part of the company." He raised his glass slightly and added with a grin, "She's just here for the family part." The words weren't cruel on the surface, but they carried the same familiar message. "She doesn't belong here." One of the managers gave an awkward smile, unsure how to respond. Another nodded politely and turned his attention back toward the stage. Jason leaned a little closer to me. "You're good here, right?" he said quietly. "Just enjoy the party." Across the room, my father was still shaking hands and accepting congratulations. He glanced in our direction for a brief moment. Our eyes met. For a second, I thought he might come over. But then someone tapped him on the shoulder and pulled him back into another conversation. Jason raised his drink toward the stage. "Here we go," he said. At the microphone, the CEO adjusted a small stack of notes and looked out over the crowd. "Robert Carter has been a loyal employee for 40 years, he said. Then he paused. "And while tonight is about celebrating Robert," his eyes moved slowly across the room, "there is someone else here we should also recognize." A ripple of curiosity moved through the crowd. I felt Jason shift slightly beside me, and then the CEO's gaze stopped. Directly on me. The room remained quiet as Daniel Harrison continued speaking at the microphone. "For 40 years, he said, Robert Carter has been a steady and loyal presence in this company." More applause filled the hall. My father nodded slightly, accepting the praise with the same calm pride he always carried at work events. Beside me, Jason leaned toward the managers we had been standing with. "See?" he whispered with a grin. "That's my old man." One of the managers chuckled politely. "You must be proud," he said. Jason lifted his glass. "Of course," he replied. "The guy practically lived here." Another manager glanced at me. "And you?" he asked. "Do you work in this industry too?" I opened my mouth to answer, but Jason spoke first. "Oh, Emma?" he said, waving his hand casually. "She's not really part of this world." The men looked at him, waiting. Jason shrugged. "She's always been different." There was a small pause. Then one of them asked gently, "Different how?" Jason smiled, clearly enjoying the attention. "Well," he said, "you know how every family has that one person who just kind of does their own thing." A few people laughed politely. Jason took another sip of his drink and added with a careless tone, "Honestly, she's nobody important in the company." For a moment, I felt the words hang in the air. Nobody. It wasn't the first time Jason had said something like that. But hearing it here, surrounded by dozens of my father's colleagues, felt strangely heavier. One of the managers shifted awkwardly. Another looked toward the stage as if pretending not to hear. Across the room, my father had turned slightly in our direction. He had clearly heard Jason. Our eyes met again, just for a second. I waited. Part of me expected him to say something, to correct it, to laugh and say Jason was exaggerating. Instead, my father simply gave a small smile, the kind people give when they don't want to interrupt a joke. Then he turned back toward the stage. The conversation around us slowly continued, but the atmosphere had changed. Jason clapped one of the managers on the shoulder. "Anyway," he said, "let's focus on Dad tonight." At the front of the room, Daniel Harrison adjusted the microphone again. "And speaking of the company," the CEO continued, "there was a moment, 5 years ago, when this organization nearly collapsed." The room grew quiet again. Several people leaned forward slightly. We were facing a crisis that could have ended everything. Jason lowered his glass. "Wait," he muttered softly. "That was the year the strategy changed." On the stage, Harrison nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "And the truth is, we would not be standing here tonight if it weren't for one person." A ripple of curiosity spread through the room. Then the CEO added, "And that person is here with us this evening." The entire room grew noticeably quieter. Even the waiters moving between tables slowed down as Daniel Harrison continued his speech. 5 years ago," he said, "this company faced the most dangerous moment in its history." Several employees exchanged looks. Most of them remembered that time. I could see it in their expressions. Jason leaned closer to one of the managers beside him. That was when the board almost shut down 2 departments, he whispered. The manager nodded, and half the leadership team wanted to cut operations entirely. On stage, Harrison continued. We had lost several major contracts within months, he said. Our revenue dropped faster than anyone expected. A low murmur passed through the room. It was the first time in decades that we had to seriously ask ourselves a question, Harrison said slowly. Would this company survive? The silence deepened. Across the room, my father stood with his arms folded, listening carefully. He had lived through that crisis. Everyone in the company had. Jason whispered again. I remember Dad coming home stressed every night back then. I didn't answer, because I remembered it too. Harrison looked around the room as if searching the faces of the employees gathered there. At that moment, he continued. We were presented with a strategy. He paused. A bold one. Someone near the front table leaned forward. A strategy that most of us believed was too risky. Several people nodded. Jason frowned slightly. That sounds familiar, he murmured. On stage, Harrison gave a small smile. Some members of leadership strongly opposed it, he said. Across the room, my father shifted his weight. I noticed the movement immediately. Jason noticed it too. Dad hated that plan, Jason whispered quietly. He said it would never work. Harrison adjusted his glasses. But one person, he continued, insisted that the company had no other choice. The room felt tense now. People were no longer just listening, they were remembering. They spent weeks studying our numbers, Harrison said, working late nights, rewriting the entire strategic structure of the company. Jason crossed his arms. Who was that again? He muttered. Harrison looked out across the room. The truth is, he said, most of you never met this person. Another ripple moved through the crowd. They preferred to stay behind the scenes. Jason shook his head. Must have been some consultant. But Harrison slowly shook his head. No, he said. They were not an outsider. A pause filled the room. Then he added quietly, they were someone much closer than that. Jason frowned. Closer? Harrison's eyes moved slowly across the crowd. Looking. Searching. And then, for the second time that evening, his gaze stopped on me. The tension in the room had changed. At first, people were simply listening to a speech. Now they were trying to solve a mystery. Daniel Harrison rested one hand lightly on the podium as he continued. The strategy that saved this company didn't come from the board, he said. A few executives in the front row exchanged glances. It didn't come from consultants either. Jason folded his arms beside me. Then where did it come from? He muttered. Harrison smiled slightly. It came from someone who understood this company in a way many of us didn't. He paused. Someone who looked at the numbers and realized we weren't failing because of the market. A few people leaned forward. We were failing because we were afraid to change. Several employees nodded slowly. Jason whispered again. Okay. Now I really want to know who this is. The CEO continued. This person proposed a plan that shocked the entire leadership team. Another pause. They wanted to restructure 3 major divisions, renegotiate long-term contracts, and completely redesign the operational model. The room grew quieter. Most of us thought the idea was reckless. Across the room, my father shifted slightly again. Jason noticed immediately. That's the plan Dad hated, he said softly. On stage, Harrison nodded. Yes, he continued. Many people believed the proposal would destroy the company. He looked toward my father briefly, but the person who created it refused to back down. Jason scoffed quietly. Whoever that was must have been pretty stubborn. Harrison smiled. Stubborn, he repeated. Then he added, "And brilliant." A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd. "This strategist worked quietly," Harrison continued. "They didn't ask for credit. They didn't appear in meetings. In fact, most of you never even saw their name on a report." Jason frowned. "That's weird." Then Harrison said something that made several employees whisper to each other. They were very young. That caught everyone's attention. "Wait," Jason whispered. "Young?" Harrison nodded slowly. "Yes. And despite their age, they saw the future of this company more clearly than the rest of us." People were now turning their heads, scanning the room, trying to guess. Jason chuckled under his breath. Must have been some genius analyst. But Harrison shook his head again. "No," he said calmly. "They were much more than that." He lifted a sheet of paper from the podium. "The truth is," another pause, "their work didn't just save the company. It changed the entire direction of our future." The room had gone completely silent now, and for the third time that evening, Harrison looked directly at me. The room was no longer just listening. People were thinking, trying to connect memories, trying to guess. Daniel Harrison looked out over the crowd with a calm expression, clearly aware of the curiosity spreading through the room. "You may not realize it," he said, "but many of you have worked under this strategy for the last 5 years." Several employees nodded slowly. Jason whispered beside me, "That's true. Everything changed after that." Harrison continued. "The logistics department was redesigned. New supply chains were built. 3 failing divisions became profitable again." A manager near the front table raised his eyebrows. "That plan doubled our production efficiency," he said quietly to someone beside him. Another employee added, "And it's the reason we survived the pandemic years." Jason tilted his head. "Okay. Now I definitely want to know who this person is." Harrison allowed the silence to linger before speaking again. "What many people don't know," he said, "is that this strategist never once asked to be recognized." He lifted the paper slightly. "In fact, they specifically requested that their name remain private." That caused a wave of surprise across the room. "Why would someone do that?" a woman asked from one of the tables. Harrison smiled. "Because they believed the work mattered more than the credit." Jason shook his head. "That's crazy." Then Harrison added another detail. They also insisted that the employees who had been with the company for decades should receive the recognition instead. My father's expression changed slightly. Jason noticed. "What?" he whispered. Harrison continued speaking. "And that brings me back to Robert Carter." The room turned toward my father again. "Robert represents the dedication that built this company." Applause followed, but Harrison raised his hand gently. "And yet," he said quietly, "Robert may not realize that his own career was protected by the very strategy he once opposed." The applause slowly faded. Jason frowned. "Wait. What?" Harrison looked around the room once more. "Tonight," he said, "I believe it's finally time to recognize the person who gave us that future." The room held its breath. Harrison looked down at the paper in his hand. And then he said, "The architect of that strategy." He slowly lifted his head. "Is standing here with us tonight." The silence in the room had changed again. At first, people had been curious. Now they were trying to figure something out. Daniel Harrison stood calmly behind the podium, the single sheet of paper still resting in his hand. But he wasn't reading it yet. Instead, he watched the room, almost as if he wanted everyone to remember something on their own. "5 years ago," he continued, "this strategist sent us a proposal that was nearly 50 pages long. A few managers near the front exchanged looks." "I remember that document," one of them whispered. "Me too," another replied quietly. "It was unlike anything we had seen before." Harrison nodded. "Yes," he said. "It contained projections, supply chain analysis, workforce restructuring models, and long-term market forecasting. Jason blinked. That sounds more like a board-level report than something from a junior analyst. Harrison smiled slightly. Exactly. He stepped away from the podium for a moment. At first, many of us thought it was impossible that someone so young could understand the entire structure of the company so clearly. A man near the front table spoke under his breath. I remember the CEO saying that same thing in the meeting. Another employee nodded. Yeah. He said whoever wrote that report understood the company better than most department heads. Jason frowned now. Wait, he murmured. He looked toward the stage again. Harrison continued slowly. What shocked us most was the accuracy of the predictions. He gestured lightly with one hand. Every major change proposed in that document eventually became the backbone of our current strategy. Several people around the room began nodding. One of the managers beside Jason spoke quietly. That plan saved at least 200 jobs. Another added, and it turned our weakest division into the most profitable one. Jason shifted his weight slightly. Whoever wrote that must have been working directly with the executive team. Harrison shook his head. No, he said. They weren't. Another wave of murmurs moved through the room. They worked mostly alone, Harrison explained. They studied our internal data, our contracts, and our operational patterns for months. Jason crossed his arms. That still doesn't explain how nobody here knows who it was. Harrison smiled again. That's because they asked us not to reveal their identity. Someone near the back asked, "Why would they do that?" Harrison answered simply, "Because they didn't want the attention." The room went quiet again. Jason scoffed softly. Hard to believe someone would turn down credit for something like that. But as he said it, I noticed something. A few employees had begun glancing in my direction. At first, it was subtle. Just a quick look. Then another. A woman near the front table leaned toward a colleague and whispered something. The man beside her turned and looked at me. Jason noticed the movement. "What?" he said quietly. The woman spoke again, louder this time. "Wait a second." She squinted slightly. "I think I've seen her before." Jason turned toward me, confused. "Seen who?" The woman raised her hand slightly and pointed. "Her." The room grew strangely still. Jason laughed awkwardly. "You mean my sister?" The woman hesitated. "I'm not sure," she said slowly. "But I swear I've seen her walking into the executive floor." Jason's smile faded. "What?" Across the room, Daniel Harrison finally returned to the podium, and for the fourth time that night, his eyes met mine. The moment the woman said it, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet way a room changes when everyone begins thinking the same thing at once. Jason laughed again, though this time the sound was forced. "You must be mistaken," he said quickly. "My sister doesn't work here." The woman looked uncertain. "Maybe," she said, "but I could swear I've seen her upstairs." Jason shook his head. "No chance." He gestured toward me casually. "Emma works somewhere else." The manager beside him spoke up. "Wait." He leaned slightly forward, studying my face more carefully. "You know what? I think she's right." Jason turned to him. "You too?" The man nodded slowly. "I've seen you in the building before." I didn't answer. Jason's confusion was now clearly visible. "What are you talking about?" he asked. "You work here?" Before I could respond, another voice joined the conversation. "I've seen her too." A woman from another table stood slightly. "She came to the leadership floor a few times last year." Jason blinked. "The leadership floor?" Someone else added quietly. "Isn't that where the strategy department works?" Jason looked at me again. This time his expression had completely changed. "What exactly do you do, Emma?" I opened my mouth. But before I could answer, Daniel Harrison's voice carried across the room again. Ladies and gentlemen, the room immediately quieted. Harrison placed the paper back onto the podium. I believe many of you are starting to remember something. He glanced around the room. You're remembering the strategist who helped guide this company through its most difficult moment. Several employees nodded slowly. Harrison continued. For 5 years, this person asked us to keep their name private. He lifted the paper again. But tonight. He paused. I believe it's time to finally give them the recognition they deserve. Jason's breathing had become noticeably slower beside me. Emma, he whispered. What is going on? Across the room, my father was staring at the stage now with complete attention. Harrison looked down at the paper one more time. Then he said, "The architect of the strategy that saved this company." The entire room leaned forward. Jason stared at me. My father stared at the stage. And Daniel Harrison slowly raised his eyes. Is someone many of you may not expect. The silence was absolute. Then he added one more sentence. They are standing here tonight. And this time. There was no doubt about who he was looking at. The silence in the banquet hall had become almost uncomfortable. No one was talking anymore. Dozens of employees were watching the stage, waiting for Daniel Harrison to finish the sentence he had started. The architect of the strategy that saved this company, he repeated slowly. He paused again. The pause wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, almost theatrical. People began looking around the room again, trying to guess who he was about to name. Jason leaned closer to me. Emma, he whispered. Do you know who he's talking about? I kept my eyes on the stage. I'm not sure. Jason studied my face for a moment, as if trying to read something there. Across the room, my father shifted his posture and folded his arms. He looked confident, relaxed, like a man who believed the spotlight of the evening belonged entirely to him. Someone near the front table murmured quietly, "Maybe it's someone from the board." Another person said, "Or one of the old strategy directors." Harrison waited for the whispers to fade before speaking again. This strategist, he continued, was not a senior executive. More murmurs spread across the room. They were not part of the board. Jason frowned. Then who the hell? Harrison raised a hand slightly, and despite their age and position at the time, he looked across the crowd slowly. Their insight changed the future of this company. A few employees began whispering again. I remember that meeting, one of the managers said. Didn't Harrison say the strategist was under 30? Jason's head turned quickly toward the stage. Under 30? Another voice from behind us added, Yeah. That shocked everyone at the time. Jason looked at me again. This time his expression was different. Not confused. Concerned. Emma, he said quietly, you're not. Before he could finish the sentence, Harrison continued speaking. For 5 years, this person asked us to keep their name private. He lifted the paper in his hand. But tonight, the room held its breath. I believe they deserve to be recognized. Harrison slowly unfolded the paper. Jason stared at it like it might explode. My father leaned slightly forward, and every employee in the room waited. Harrison took one last look at the audience. Then he said, The name of the strategist who saved this company. He glanced at the paper. Is Emma Carter. For a moment, nothing happened. The name seemed to float in the air like it didn't belong there. Then the room reacted. Heads turned, dozens of them, all at once, toward me. Jason blinked. What? He looked around the room, confused. Wait. Who? Harrison repeated calmly into the microphone. Emma Carter. Now the silence became absolute. Jason slowly turned his head toward me. His mouth opened slightly. Emma? Across the room, my father was staring at the stage with a puzzled expression. He clearly hadn't processed what he had just heard. Harrison continued speaking. 5 years ago, when our company faced collapse, Emma Carter presented the strategic restructuring plan that saved us. The room erupted into murmurs. That's her? No way. Is that Robert's daughter? Jason shook his head. No, that's not possible. He looked directly at me now. You're Emma Carter. It wasn't a question. It was disbelief. I finally spoke. Yes. Jason stared. But, you don't work here? I do. The manager beside him whispered, she's part of the corporate strategy division. Jason stepped back slightly. What? On stage, Harrison continued. For 5 years, Emma asked us to keep her identity private. He smiled toward me. She believed the work mattered more than the recognition. Several employees had already started clapping, then more joined. Within seconds, the entire room filled with applause. My father hadn't moved. He was still staring at the stage, trying to process what he had just heard. Harrison spoke again. Emma, would you please join me on stage? Every eye in the room turned toward me. Jason looked like the ground had disappeared beneath him. Emma? He said my name again, but this time the word sounded completely different. Not dismissive, not casual, just shocked. I took a breath and stepped forward. For a moment, my legs didn't move. The applause in the room was growing louder, echoing off the tall ceilings of the banquet hall. But I could still hear Jason's voice beside me. Emma. He sounded like he was trying to solve a puzzle that suddenly had too many pieces. You're the strategist? I didn't answer, because at that moment, the entire room was watching me. Daniel Harrison stood patiently on the stage, one hand resting lightly on the podium. Emma, he repeated with a warm smile. Please join me. The applause continued. I took a breath. Then I stepped forward. The walk toward the stage felt strangely long. Dozens of employees watched as I moved between the tables. Some of them were smiling. Others looked stunned. A few whispered quietly to each other. That's Robert's daughter? I didn't know she worked in strategy. She's the one who wrote that report? I reached the steps of the stage. Daniel Harrison extended his hand. Thank you for finally letting us tell the truth, he said quietly as he helped me up. The applause slowly faded as the room settled again. Harrison turned back toward the microphone. 5 years ago, he said, Emma Carter presented the most detailed strategic restructuring proposal this company had ever seen. He gestured toward me. She studied our financial reports, operational structures, and supply chain weaknesses for nearly 6 months. A manager near the front table nodded. I remember those reports, he said. They predicted almost everything that happened. Harrison continued. Her proposal allowed us to renegotiate major contracts, restructure failing departments, and rebuild the operational model of the company. The room remained completely silent. Without that strategy, Harrison said calmly, this company would not exist today. Another wave of applause spread across the room. I glanced toward my father. He was staring at the stage now with an expression I had never seen before. Not anger, not pride. Something closer to confusion. Harrison continued speaking. And there is one detail many people here may find surprising. He paused. 5 years ago, when Emma presented her plan, he looked toward my father. One of the strongest voices opposing the strategy was Robert Carter. The room reacted instantly. Several employees turned toward my father. Jason looked between us. Wait, he whispered. Dad fought that plan? Harrison nodded. Yes, he said calmly, but that disagreement is part of what makes tonight so meaningful. Across the room, my father still hadn't moved. He was staring at me now, trying to reconcile the daughter he thought he knew, with the person standing on the stage. Daniel Harrison adjusted the microphone slightly. When Emma first presented her proposal, he said, many people believed it was too ambitious. Several managers nodded. That's true, one of them said quietly. The scale of the changes was huge. Harrison continued. The plan required restructuring 3 major departments. He raised 3 fingers slightly: operations, logistics, and supplier contracts. A few employees exchanged glances. That was the biggest operational shift we've ever done, someone murmured. Harrison nodded. And yet, every projection Emma included in her analysis proved correct. He gestured toward the room. Within 2 years, the company recovered every major contract we had lost. More murmurs spread through the crowd. Production increased by 30%. Employee retention improved. And our most struggling division became our most profitable. Jason slowly ran a hand through his hair. Emma, he whispered again, almost to himself. Across the room, my father looked like someone who had just discovered an entirely different version of reality. He turned toward one of the managers standing beside him. You're saying she wrote that strategy? The manager nodded carefully. Yes. Robert stared at the stage again. Harrison smiled. And there is something else you should know. He turned toward me slightly. Emma asked that we never publicly credit her for this work. The employees reacted with surprise. Why? Someone asked from one of the tables. Harrison answered simply. Because she believed the people who had dedicated decades to this company deserved the recognition. The room grew quiet again. Harrison looked toward my father. In other words, he paused. She wanted the success of the strategy to honor the people who built this company. Several employees began clapping again. This time more slowly, more thoughtfully. Jason lowered his head slightly. Only an hour earlier he had laughed and said, "She's nobody." Now the entire company was applauding her. Harrison stepped slightly aside from the microphone. Emma, he said gently, I believe the company would like to hear from you. Every person in the room turned toward me. The applause faded. The microphone stood in front of me. And for the first time that night, I spoke. The microphone felt strangely heavy in front of me. Hundreds of people were watching. Managers, executives, employees who had worked in the company longer than I had been alive, and somewhere in the crowd, my father. I took a breath. For a moment, I considered saying something formal, something simple. But the words that came out were different. 5 years ago, I began quietly. I was just a young analyst studying market data. The room was completely silent. I had been reviewing the company's financial reports for weeks. I glanced briefly toward Daniel Harrison, who nodded slightly, and the more I studied the numbers, the more I realized something. I paused. The company wasn't failing because the people here lacked dedication. Several employees nodded slowly. It was failing because the system they were working in was outdated. A few managers exchanged thoughtful looks. So I wrote a proposal. A small smile crossed my face. A very long proposal. A few people laughed softly. Jason, however, wasn't laughing. He was staring at me like he had never seen me before. I didn't expect anyone to take it seriously, I continued. I was young. I didn't have a big title. The room remained quiet, but I believed the people who worked here deserved a chance to succeed. I looked toward the audience again. People like the technicians, the logistics teams, the managers who had spent decades keeping the company alive. My eyes briefly moved toward my father, and the employees who had given 40 years of their lives to the company. A soft murmur spread through the room. I didn't want recognition, I said. I only wanted the plan to work. Someone in the crowd asked quietly, "So that's why you kept your name secret?" I nodded. Yes, because if the strategy succeeded, I paused again. The credit should belong to the people who built the company long before I arrived. Applause began again, slow at first, then louder. Jason lowered his head slightly. Only an hour earlier he had laughed and said, "She's nobody." Now the entire company was applauding. I let the applause fade before finishing. I never needed people to know my name, I said softly. I only needed the work to matter. Then I stepped back from the microphone. The room erupted into applause again. But across the room, my father wasn't clapping. He was staring at me. And slowly, his expression changed. The applause lasted longer than I expected. Some employees even stood up from their chairs. Daniel Harrison shook my hand again, smiling proudly. You've earned this moment, he said quietly. But my attention had already shifted. Toward the back of the room. Toward my father. Robert Carter had not moved. He was standing exactly where he had been during the entire speech, but his expression had changed completely. For the first time that evening, he looked uncertain. Jason walked slowly toward him. Dad, he said carefully. Robert didn't answer. His eyes were still fixed on the stage. 5 years ago, he murmured quietly. Jason frowned. What? Robert continued speaking almost to himself. That proposal. Jason blinked. You remember it? Robert nodded slowly. I argued against it. Jason nodded. Yeah. You said it would destroy operations. Robert exhaled slowly. I told everyone it was unrealistic. He shook his head slightly. I said whoever wrote it didn't understand how the company worked. Jason looked toward the stage again, then back at his father. Well, he hesitated. Turns out she did. Robert closed his eyes briefly, and suddenly memories started connecting in his mind. Late nights during the crisis, emergency meetings, arguments with executives, and a strategy document that had arrived out of nowhere. The plan that eventually saved everything. Robert whispered quietly, she was the one. Jason didn't respond. Robert looked toward the stage again. For years he had believed that the strategist who created the plan was some experienced executive. Someone older, someone powerful. Not the quiet daughter he barely understood. Across the room, employees were still congratulating each other. But Robert barely noticed them. Because now he understood something else. Emma hadn't just saved the company, she had saved his career. Without that strategy, his department would have been one of the first to close. Robert finally took a step forward. Jason watched him carefully. Dad? Robert didn't stop walking. He moved slowly through the crowd toward the stage, toward me. And when he reached the front row, he stopped. For a moment he simply stood there, looking up. Then he spoke quietly. Emma. The word sounded different now. Not distant, not dismissive, just heavy with realization and regret. The room slowly quieted as people noticed my father standing near the stage. Robert Carter had always carried himself with confidence. Tonight, however, he looked different. Older somehow. More uncertain. Daniel Harrison stepped slightly away from the microphone, sensing that something important was about to happen. My father looked up at me. For several seconds, he said nothing. The silence stretched across the room. Then he spoke. Emma? His voice was softer than I had ever heard it before. I didn't know. The words were simple, but they carried years of misunderstanding. I stepped down from the stage so we were standing at the same level. You didn't ask, I said gently. The sentence wasn't cruel. It was simply true. A few employees shifted awkwardly. Jason stood a few feet behind my father, watching the exchange like someone witnessing a moment he wasn't prepared for. Robert exhaled slowly. For years, he said, I thought the strategist who wrote that plan was someone important. He paused. Someone experienced. Someone older. Someone who understood the company better than I did. His voice grew quieter. I never imagined it was my own daughter. The room remained completely silent. Robert rubbed his hands together briefly as if unsure what to do next. Then he said the words everyone could feel coming. I was wrong. He turned slightly toward the employees in the room. My daughter didn't just understand the company. He glanced back at me. She understood it better than I did. Several employees nodded respectfully. Robert continued. And earlier tonight? He hesitated. My son said something about Emma. Jason stiffened behind him. Robert didn't look at him, but everyone in the room knew exactly what he meant. She's nobody. The words sounded heavier now. Robert shook his head slowly. That was never true. He looked directly at me. You were never nobody. The room stayed quiet. Then he added something that surprised everyone. I'm proud of you. The words were simple, but they felt like something that had taken years to reach the surface. For a moment, I didn't answer. Not because I was angry, but because I knew this moment mattered more than any speech. Finally, I smiled slightly. You don't have to be proud of me, I said softly. I only wanted you to believe in me. The room went completely silent again. The silence after Emma's words lasted longer than anyone expected. I only wanted you to believe in me. The sentence hung in the air. For the first time that night, Jason stepped forward. He looked uncomfortable. Not the confident, joking version of himself everyone had seen earlier. This was different. He stopped a few feet away from us. Emma, he said quietly. His voice sounded strange, almost unfamiliar. I turned toward him. For years, Jason had always been the loudest person in the room, the one telling stories, the one making jokes. But now he seemed to struggle just to speak. He rubbed the back of his neck. I guess I owe you an apology, too. A few employees nearby glanced at each other. Jason looked down briefly. Earlier tonight, he said slowly, I told people you were nobody. He gave a short, embarrassed laugh. That didn't age well. A few people smiled softly, but Jason didn't laugh. He looked directly at me. I didn't know what you actually did. He paused. Honestly, I never really asked. The words echoed something Emma had already said to Robert. Jason sighed. You were always quiet about your work. I shrugged slightly. I didn't think it mattered. Jason shook his head. Well, he gestured around the room. It definitely matters now. A few employees chuckled lightly. Jason looked toward the stage where Daniel Harrison was still standing. So you're the strategist who saved the company. He let out a breath. Wow. There was no jealousy in his voice now. Only disbelief. And a little admiration. You know, he added with a small smile. I spent the whole night trying to impress people who were actually here to thank you. The tension in the room finally softened. Several employees began clapping again. Not loudly this time, but respectfully. Jason stepped back slightly. Anyway, he said, I'm glad you came tonight. Before I could answer, Daniel Harrison returned to the microphone. If I may interrupt for just a moment, he said. The room quieted again. Harrison looked toward me. There is one more announcement I would like to make. Employees turned toward the stage. After everything Emma Carter has contributed to this company. He paused. The board of directors has unanimously voted to invite her to join them. A wave of surprise moved through the room. Jason blinked. Wait. Harrison smiled. Emma Carter will officially become the newest member of the board. The applause this time was immediate. Louder. Stronger. And as the room filled with applause, I noticed something I hadn't expected. My father was smiling. The applause lasted for several seconds. Some employees were still standing. Others were shaking their heads in disbelief, smiling as they looked toward the stage. Daniel Harrison stepped aside again, allowing the moment to belong to the room. I stood quietly beside him. Joining the board had never been the reason I did the work. But seeing the people in the room now People whose jobs had once depended on the strategy I wrote, made the moment feel meaningful in a different way. Jason leaned toward my father and whispered something. Robert nodded slowly. Then he looked back at me. This time, the expression on his face was different from anything I had seen before. Not confusion, not regret. Respect. The applause eventually faded. Music began playing again in the background as the event slowly returned to its celebratory atmosphere. People approached the stage one by one. Managers shook my hand. Employees thanked me for the work I had done years earlier. Some of them even told stories about how the strategy had changed their departments. But the person who took the longest to reach the stage was my father. Robert waited until most of the crowd had stepped away. Then he walked forward quietly. For a moment, we simply looked at each other. "So," he said softly, "I guess I underestimated you." I smiled slightly. "You weren't the only one." He shook his head slowly. "No." His voice was thoughtful now. "I spent my whole life believing success looked a certain way." He gestured toward the room. "A big title. Recognition. People talking about your achievements." He looked back at me. "But tonight I realized something." "What's that?" I asked. Robert smiled faintly. The person who changed the future of the company was standing quietly in the room the whole time. I didn't respond right away, because in some ways, that had always been true. Jason joined us a moment later. "Well," he said with an awkward grin, "I guess next time someone asks me what my sister does." He paused. "I'll have a better answer." We all laughed softly. The tension that had filled the room earlier was completely gone now. Across the hall, employees were still celebrating my father's retirement. The event had finally returned to what it was meant to be, a celebration. Robert looked at me one more time. "Emma?" he said quietly. "Yes? I'm glad you came tonight." I nodded. "So am I." For a moment, I looked around the room. At the employees, at the stage, at the company that had nearly disappeared 5 years earlier. And then I said something that made my father smile. "You know," I said softly, "being somebody was never the goal." I paused. I just didn't want to be invisible to the people who mattered. The music continued playing, the conversations resumed, and for the first time in a very long time, my family was standing beside me, not because they had to, but because they finally understood who I was. Sometimes the hardest thing in life isn't proving the world wrong, it's proving the people you love wrong. For years, Emma never tried to correct her family's assumptions. She didn't argue when they underestimated her. She didn't fight to prove her success. She simply did the work, quietly, patiently. And when the moment finally came, the truth spoke louder than any explanation ever could. Because real value doesn't always look impressive at first. Sometimes the most important people in the room are the ones standing quietly in the background. The ones who don't need recognition. The ones who understand that real success isn't about applause. It's about impact. And sometimes the people we underestimate the most are the ones holding everything together. Emma didn't come to the retirement party to prove anyone wrong. She came because it was her father's moment. But that night reminded everyone of something important. Sometimes the person you think is nobody is actually the one who saved everything. If this story moved you, tell me in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated by someone close to you? And if you enjoy emotional family stories like this one, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay for the next story. Because sometimes the quietest people have the most powerful stories to tell.